Well, another very warm welcome back to the latest episode of Classic Dirt Bike TV, where we continue to rediscover more of those old school vintage and classic race bikes from back in the day. Now, a quick hello here to all the brand new subscribers who have just recently signed up to my channel, and welcome aboard. And I do hope you continue to find more of these old classics and rare dirt bikes quite interesting as you continue to browse my channel. Now, it won't be long now before we hit the start of a brand new racing season here in the UK, and in fact we will be attending our very first race event this weekend as we head off to a Scottish Twin Shock and Evolution Round 1 event at Drumclog this weekend. So hopefully from that event we will pick up some very nice Twin Shock or Evolution bikes to feature here on my channel. But until then, let's dive straight into our next video. Now, this particular bike here is part of the Rob Hughes vintage dirt bike collection, and although the bike is not classic or vintage, it's still quite a rare item indeed. So without any further delay, let's jump in and have a look at this Hondaberg 4-stroke motocrosser. Now, I expect that you're all probably wondering just how come that we're actually featuring this particular bike here on my channel when it's not really vintage and certainly not a classic because of its age. But the main reason for including it in here is just because it is something that little bit different and certainly unique, because let's face it, how many Hondabergs have you seen on the track lately? But this featured Hondaberg motorcycle is the last in the current series of bikes from the Rob Hughes Classic Motorcycles collection, and it's only right that we give it an airing here, because Rob has been very kind in the past to supply my channel with some superb motocross specimens that have been hugely popular. So don't get yourselves in a sweat here thinking that we're going to begin by featuring modern bikes here on Classic Dirt Bike TV, because we will be back to those old school racers once more in my next video posting. So getting on to our subject machine here. Now, this rather unusually titled Hondaberg is, as you've no doubt gathered, a hybrid race bike, because it's made from a Honda CR250 2-stroke chassis, and it also has a big 501 single-cylinder 4-stroke Husaberg engine as its power plant. Now, some of you may or may not have heard of these Hondaberg bikes, although I'll wager that most of you won't have heard of them, and to be fair, they are a bit of an enigma, and any information or background on their construction is more or less non-existent, and even that encyclopedia of knowledge, the World Wide Web, couldn't even come up with a single answer to a Hondaberg. Although thankfully, in true James Bond style, a good friend and spy of mine did manage to uncover a few details and a bit of background on these elusive Hondabergs, so that we could then share it all with you here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. So the story goes that this Hondaberg was a project that was started and developed by a small team at DCR Racing, or Dave Clark Racing to give them their full title. Now, that team consisted of Roger Heap, who was the top man, and he was ably assisted by Andy Garlick and Dave and Jack Clark of DCR. Now, Roger Heap's idea was to try and build a 4-stroke bike that was lighter and more competitive than the bikes that were racing on the track at the time, and you have to remember that these were the days even before the mighty YZF 400 Yamaha and Honda CRF 4-strokes were the dominant force in motocross. Now, Roger's initial thoughts that the 1997 alloy cradle type chassis of the Honda CR250 would be a suitable donor bike, and although he wanted to retain all of the exterior looks of the Honda bike, he still wanted it to be powered by a single-cylinder 4-stroke engine. Now, sometime later, Roger then purchased a 1997 CR250 rolling chassis from a Honda GP race team, which was really just a chassis that was used for promotional purposes, so it had seen very little action on the track, and it was in great condition and absolutely perfect for this project. Now, with the Honda cradle designed frame all stripped down, Roger then used a mock-up Husaberg motor just to check how the engine would fit inside the chassis, and as it turns out, it appeared that very little work was going to be needed to make it fit, although naturally it wasn't just going to slot straight in. Now, Roger had to manufacture engine mounting brackets so that he could continue to use the frame's existing mounting points and to eliminate the need for any welding on the alloy chassis. Then Roger just availed himself of a big 501 Husaberg motor and then bolted it into the chassis. Now, one of the adjustments that were made to make the Swedish motor slot into the Japanese frame was that the airbox had to be realigned to fit the Husaberg's air intake, and the rear top shock mount was also moved. Now, a brand new alloy fuel tank was then fabricated to accommodate the extra height of that tall Husaberg cylinder. Now again, as you'd expect, a brand new exhaust system had to be made to work around that Husaberg engine and Honda frame, which, as you can see, was manufactured by SPR, who Rob, the bike's owner, told me stood for Spare Parts Racing. But nevertheless, it still looks the part, and I'm also assuming that this alloy tailpipe at the rear is another SPR part, which will probably emit a very good grunt when that big Husaberg motor gets fired up. Although at the end of the day, Rogers still managed to fit a big single-cylinder four-stroke motor into a frame that was originally built to house a much smaller 250 two-stroke engine, and other than the modifications already mentioned, Rogers still managed to keep the original look of the Honda CR Motocrosser. Now again, and as I recall back in 1997, I think these CR250 Honda chassis were fitted with a pair of 47mm Showa forks, and as far as I'm aware, these are still the very same forks that are fitted here onto our Hondaberg. And although they did do quite a decent job for their time, riders did tend to think that they were a bit undersprung and quite harsh at times, and they certainly gave your wrists a workout on particularly bumpy racetracks. Now again, the rear shock, as I assume, is still the stock Showa rear suspension unit, although as I mentioned earlier, this had to be slightly repositioned at the top mounting just to allow the fitment of that larger Husaberg engine. But as I said, when Roger and the boys at DCR put this bike together, they wanted to keep all of the original Honda parts on the bike, other than, of course, the engine. And you can see here that they have still used the original alloy swing arm, which looks like it's had a bit of spit and polish done on it to spruce it up a bit. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will have already spotted that this bike doesn't have a drive chain fitted, and that's because the bike's owner, Rob, was using it on another one of his machines, and because he was in need of a chain in a hurry and the Hondaberg doesn't get used that much, it seemed to be the obvious choice as the machine to give up its transmission drive chain. Although at the end of the day, Roger Heap and the team at Dave Clark Racing still achieved what they set out to do on this project, and that was to use a tried and tested alloy motocross chassis and then retrofit it with a bigger and bolder four-stroke motor, and still, of course, retain all of the aesthetic looks of the original Honda CR donor bike. Now, it's said that after this bike was completed, it was then written by Dave Clark, and a feature was then written on the bike for the UK-based Trials and Motocross newspaper back in the day. So maybe if you have an old back issue of that publication, then you can maybe read a bit more on this DCR project. Although I have to say that I do have it on good authority that this bike did perform quite well against the period 4-stroke motocrossers that raced at that time, which again was about a year or two before the mighty YZF 400 Yamaha hit the motocross scene. But after the bike's initial baptism on the track and having a few races under its belt, it's said that Roger still wanted to make improvements to the cornering ability of the bike, and he then went on to manufacture 3 more Hondabergs, only this time he used his own designed frame and swing arm, and he still has those bikes in his possession. But as I mentioned, this bike is neither vintage or classic, but nevertheless it's a very interesting concept using that 1997 Honda CR250 chassis and that Swedish 4-stroke 500cc power plant. And the chances are that if you were ever lucky enough to see one of these Hondabergs on a racetrack back in the day, you'd more than likely just pass it off as another Honda CR motocrosser, but that is of course until you'd hear that big Husaberg engine fly by you at breakneck speed. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that quite rare machine. It's neither vintage or classic, but nevertheless quite a rare bike, and certainly one of those machines that I'd never even heard of until I'd actually took the pictures of the bike. But a very rare machine indeed, and that's another bike from the Rob Hughes classic collection, a lovely Hondaberg. Okay, so coming up in my next video posting, we're going to go back to an old twin shocker once again, and this time round we're going to take a look at one of the bikes from the Trevor Calderwood collection, and when we return we will be taking a look at this lovely 360 CZ twin shocker. Now, of course, this is not an original bike from its particular year, but nevertheless it has some very nice parts fitted onto it, and we'll be taking a look at this bike in some detail when we return with the next episode of CDB TV. But until then, of course, everybody continue to be safe and well out there while you're riding those old vintage dirt bikes, and we hope to see you back here again very soon to talk about more of this old vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV.